Our gospel reading picks up more or less where last week's reading left off. We have a whole series in the Gospel of Mark of Jesus teaching and healing. There's a phrase for how Jesus is portrayed, particularly in the Gospel of Mark. Here he is, more than anything else, a wonder worker. He does wonderful, amazing, astonishing, miraculous things. And they are, for the author of this gospel, all more signs that Jesus is who that early community said he was, and that people were hoping him to be, the anointed one of God, the Messiah. And here are two more healing stories. I would say back to back, but it's actually one and another interrupts the other. There is this unrelenting urgency, a sense of interrupting chaos. These fold in on one another. All this need, one thing can't even be done before the next need arises. So when Jesus was trying to catch a nap on the boat on his way to the other shore, it's because he had some sense that when he landed on the other shore, there was going to be more waiting for him, and there was. Hear these words from the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the little girl was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. May God add understanding to the hearing of these words. Will you pray with me, please? Holy and gracious God, be within us and among us as we turn our hearts and our minds to you. Amen. Last week, you might remember, the story was Jesus stilling the stormy seas. And the lesson for us in that story and for the disciples was about facing these storms with faith and not fear. Fear is what is contrasted with faith in this gospel. Not doubt, it's fear. You hear Jesus say it again to this man here. Do not be afraid, just believe. And the word is actually faith, but we don't have a verb for faith. So we say, do not fear, have faith. It's fear that gets in the way and takes us over and gets us stuck and makes us useless. And even though there is plenty to be afraid of, being afraid doesn't get us anywhere. And so faith, in the face of it all, trust, courage, belief, hope in the face of all that, that's what keeps us moving. So do what you can and do your part. Let God do the rest. And then rest up from time to time, because by the time you get to shore, as I said, there's already more waiting for you. And there is for Jesus here. He's barely on land before there is again this crush of crowd and agonizing need. This time, at least at first, it's one of the leaders of the synagogue. Jairus, powerful, influential, righteous man. And we find him here, though, throwing himself at the feet of Jesus, begging him over and over again to come and save his 12-year-old daughter from death. This is raw humanity. No more time for pride or decorum or respectability or any of the other power games we usually play. At this point, he is just a terrified father who will do anything. And Jesus agrees and is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter when we are suddenly introduced to someone else. Someone else we find in her own raw humanity. An unnamed woman who is, at least on paper, everything that Jairus is not. A woman with some kind of disease or disorder. It's assumed here because of the hemorrhaging to be a menstrual disorder, the nature of which makes her ritually unclean, which means she can't be by people. This woman is not only broken, but broke. She has spent all that she has trying to get healed, but she's no better. She is everything on paper that Jairus is not. But in this moment, they are not that different. Crisis is the great leveler. And here it brings society's highest and lowest to the same place, to the feet of Jesus on the ground, looking for help. Both with the faith to face their fears, both with the courage born of desperation, both believing that Jesus could do something, and both in their own way with very little left to lose. But not nothing to lose, and maybe this is why this woman goes about using her faith and claiming her healing in a different way. Maybe Jairus publicly was risking his dignity. She was quite literally risking her life. She had no business being around people, let alone touching people, let alone touching a man, let alone touching a respected public spiritual figure like Jesus. And they could have, this crowd, by all rights, stoned her to death if they caught her. But maybe that is part of her point. What can these people do to me that life hasn't already done? And that might be her mission. Get well or die trying. Or maybe you could say this is why she goes about it, how she does it, kind of secretly. And if you want to get technical, she doesn't actually even touch Jesus, just his clothes. If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well, she says. That's how much faith she has. And it works. Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. It took something out of Jesus to do this. Fascinatingly, this story talks about power, energy, whatever you want to call it, going out of him when this happened, and he felt it. Whatever power that healed her came from Jesus. But again, fascinatingly, without him knowing about it, or consenting to it, or doing it on purpose. The sense we get here is of Jesus as a conduit. He is a pass-through for the power of God. And she claimed from him, through her faith, some of the power of God she somehow knew was in him. And it worked. Don't think about that too hard. We haven't figured it out. Now, how many of us, if we were her, and we were honest, would have just left it there? She could have presumably walked away with what she came for, and no one had to know. Transaction completed. Jesus is looking around asking who touched him, and she's the only one who knows what happened. But she does come forward, and it means that when she does come forward, in fear and trembling, as the story says, she comes forward to tell Jesus the whole truth about what had happened. She's making her private struggle suddenly very public. You can argue that that was an even bigger risk, and therefore an even greater act of faith than what she had done before. Why would she risk it? Is one of the questions in this story. What was she going for that she didn't already have? There's an element of confession to this. Here's the whole truth. There's an element of testimony to it, a public witness. Everybody, this is my story. Her faith is rewarded. Jesus calls her daughter. You are a beloved member of the family. He blesses her and sends her into the rest of her life in peace. She could have taken off and been presumably cured and alone. Here, as part of her whole life, part of her salvation, truly, she is restored to her community. Not just back to health, back to living. Back to Jairus. This interruption has apparently cost precious time. And a group of people come to let him know that in that intervening time, while he was gone, his daughter has died. Which they tell him, as people sometimes do when they don't know what to say, in the most callously, casually, cruel way possible. Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? It's over. Why bother? Don't let your tragedy become an inconvenience. We as people can be really hard to be around sometimes. And I know you heard this part of the story already too, but like the part before, there are some very special moments worth highlighting again. And one, maybe it's not a highlight exactly, but it's another example of us as people being hard to be around. Jesus is proclaiming to these mourners, making a great show of mourning as you do, explaining to these mourners that the girl is not dead, but sleeping, and they're not scared or astonished or amazed or even curious about this. They just laugh at him. It's a reminder that there have always been those who will find what we are trying to do just ridiculous. And I think besides maybe the guards mocking Jesus as he awaits trial, I don't know of another moment in the Gospels, somebody will look it up later and correct me, but I don't know of another moment in the Gospels where Jesus is just laughed at like he is here. And so he, as the story says, puts them all outside. One wonders with what kind of words he asked them to recuse themselves. And the other famous moment in this story is a tender one. There's no grand gesture or bombastic flash of magic or even a religious ritual. Jesus simply steps over to the girl, takes her hand, and says to her, "Talitha cum," little girl, get up. as though whatever needed to be done was already done, and he was just helping her up. I am always moved, for some reason, when we get our little tastes of Aramaic in the Gospels, the language Jesus actually spoke. It's just a glimpse of what Jesus would have sounded like the whole time. As though layers of tradition and translation are peeled away, and for a second we can tunnel through this, and we can hear what we would have actually heard then. Someone saying, Talitha cum. And the little girl gets up, and he asks, and I find this delightful too, that they get her something to eat, which is what I think every 12-year-old would want after the kind of day she has had, which is a snack. How many of us miss someone and would give anything to do something everyday basic like just get them a snack again? I love it because it's so ordinary. She is back now to the basic concerns that living people are lucky enough to have. And like the woman before her, she is not just back to life, but back to living. And these stories, back to back, they reinforce the lessons from last week. Amidst so much to be afraid of, we see faith at work here in the face of life's storms. We're not trying to do it all. We're not called to be, as Jesus is, a wonder worker. Again, as we said last week, the point of these stories is not that the magic was inside us all along. These are stories about what God can do. About what made Jesus not like everybody else. Our part is to not let ourselves get stuck in the fear. There's a lot of storm around us, sound and fury that's unrelentingly loud and tells us it's all important. And that can inflame us, as we said, and exhaust us, and make us fearful and bitter and resentful and anxious. So let's watch ourselves and watch what we give our attention to. Managing our attention is a spiritual discipline. But then, this is the challenge that this week's stories add to that. Even when it's difficult, we need to commit to community. Especially when it's difficult. Because anybody does it when it's easy. So especially when it's difficult, we need to commit to community, which is a phrase I have to attribute to, because it's true and it's where I heard it, to Tom Foley. A little over a week ago, he said, commit to community, and I think it's brilliant. We were at a Boys and Girls Club of Dundee Township open house community event, and we were marveling together at the incredible work, some others of us were there too, marveling together at the incredible work that they do. 2,000 kids, 90% of whom are below the poverty line, 14 different sites, $6 million annual budget. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many had no idea that that was happening? I know that was me just a couple of years ago. But you could say the same about a lot of places. Tom has found the same insight, and many of you have, with Fish Food Pantry. There are a lot of places and a lot of people doing incredible work that most people don't realize is happening. In part because a lot of people are stuck inside, marinating in infotainment cable news or just perpetually online, which are great places to live if you want to be convinced that people are awful and the world is going to hell. They're also a great way to have a lot of information and at the same time almost no idea of what's really happening. And instead we need to be where real people are really living. Commit to community is a moral orientation. I live my life open to and facing other people, engaged and not closed off, not turning my back on the world. Commit to community is an ethical imperative. I need other people, and other people need me. Now I need to act like it. That should shape everything I do. Jesus could have escaped. Jesus could have lived separately. And he didn't. He showed up in the middle of the mess and brought his disciples with him into the middle of the mess. And they did what they could. In so many ways, it is easier than ever for us to live separately. And who can blame us? You look at these stories, real life is a mess. Real people are hard to be around. There are people there who will drive you nuts and drain your energy. Not here, everywhere else. People will say dumb things and misunderstand and be casually cruel and laugh at you. Community is messy. Community is needy. Community is troubling and uncomfortable. But community has one thing going for it that nothing else does. Community is real. And the real world needs you. Like Jairus and our bleeding, broke woman, we can think we are very different. We can live very separately. But that separateness is an illusion. And the little bubbles we make for ourselves will burst. We are in this together. And as different as we think we are, life has a way of leveling us. It will some days drive us all to the feet of Jesus, saying, "Please help me." And when this woman and when this girl are saved, it is not just about them. It is not just about individual healing. It's about being restored to their families, being part of the world again. We are never saved alone. And we're never saved for ourselves only. When we find health and wholeness, we will find it together. Which means God is still looking for those who will face the world and stay in this work. Not to do it all, or even most of it, but those who have enough faith to commit to community. Thanks be to God. Amen.